Hi and welcome everyone to tonight's episode of the Naked Truth Show, Canine Conversations as They Should Be, brought to you by Naked Dog. We are a raw dog food company, so this is dog food as it should be, which I know tonight's vet will agree with. I'm just going to show you one of our wonderful products. We have quite a few in the range. We have a range of original foods. We have a range of superfood foods, which contain lots of lovely anti-inflammatory superfoods as well for your dog. And we have a range of active dog food. We also have a range of 80-10-10, and very excitingly, we will soon have, it's caused a bit of a stir this week actually, but we will soon have our puppy range. So you can find all the Naked Dog meals for puppies imminently, and for adult dogs in your nearest pet food store. So we are retail only, supporting the community of retailers, which quite frankly over 2020 and the beginning of 2021 really need our support. So we're very proud to be only stocked in retailers and supporting the retail community at these times. And today we are going to be talking to Lise Hansen, who is a holistic vet, and she practices in London in the UK, and also, is it the Netherlands, Lise?
Denmark.
In Denmark, okay.
Denmark and London, yeah.
So we're going to be talking about vaccines. I find actually that what tends to happen once somebody has made the shift to feeding fresh food, they begin to question the rest of their protocols with pets. They begin to question flea treatments, for instance, or worming treatments. And of course, they begin to question vaccinations as well. So I don't know about you, but I sort of see nutrition as the inroad. It's kind of like opening the door, and people are like, okay, well, if that's better, then what about the other things that I'm doing? So really, really keen to hear what you've got to say tonight on vaccinations. It's a big subject, so I'm sure we're not going to cover it all in the time that we've got, but we'll make a good start, and I hope leave people with some tips and some things to really consider. So would you mind just giving us a little bit of an intro, because I'm not sure how long you have been practicing as a vet, or
Oh my God, I've been practicing as a vet for nearly 30 years.
Oh, yeah. Okay, you're one of
like 28 years, I think. So a very, very, very long time. But I think I couldn't agree more with what you just said, really. I think, so I've certainly found for myself, having practiced for a very long time, that my interest increasingly has gone from, I mean, I don't mean it, don't get me wrong, but, you know, not just patching up animals that come to me severely ill, having gone down, you know, a lot of unfortunate terms in terms of their health, but actually taking more of an interest, or an equal interest, in looking at what we do to maintain their health. And like you just said, I mean, I think there are 4 areas that you need to look at, and we all need to look at when we look after dogs. And they are diet, they are parasite control, vaccination, and not to forget neutering. There's a lot of new science on neutering as well. And all of us, I don't think it's about being holistic or being natural. It's about being up to date and looking at the evidence that's around. And a lot of us tend to, and that goes for dog owners and breeders and vets, that we kind of do what we've always done. You know, there's a sort of, well, I've had dogs for 30 years, or I've been a vet for 30 years, and this is what I've always said, and this is what I've always done, and that. So you just sort of tend to think that that's how it is. But it's a very interesting time, really, if you're interested in dog health, because a lot of new science has surfaced. Vaccination is probably, out of those 4 areas I just mentioned, the one that has been quite well documented certainly for way more than a decade now. It just sometimes seems like we're not really following the science on that. But neutering, the advice on neutering is very, very new, and many people are not aware of it. Parasite control is something that really needs addressed in the future, and diet, like you say. So I think for all of us, we just owe it to our dogs to look into these things, and not just to do out of, I don't know, laziness or comfort or habit or whatever it is. We can't just do what we've always done, because the science says differently, and we need to look at that. And vaccination is certainly one of those big areas for sure. Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. So tell us what the science actually is.
Yeah, I
Vaccine.
mean, it used to be, when I started out as a vet, we used to vaccinate every dog and cat every year. And we didn't really, I mean, you look back and you think, how could I not, how could I just, but I mean, everybody did. It wasn't really something we questioned. It was considered responsible pet ownership that you had every vaccine every year. And we didn't consider at all that vaccines could do harm. And then historically, if I know we don't have all the time in the world, but I mean, the late 90s, the veterinary profession became aware that vaccines could do harm, and it happened quite dramatically in that what was then called vaccine-induced sarcomas. It was discovered that it was a new type of cancer in cats that would invariably kill the cats that were that became ill from it, and it was directly caused by a vaccine. They get a tumor right where you inject them, primarily with the leukemia vaccine or the rabies vaccine, but it's rare. It still happens, but I mean, obviously most cats get these vaccines without trouble. But the main significance of it was that we haven't really considered as a profession before that vaccines could actually not just cause harm, but kill. You had a healthy animal, you took them to the vet for a vaccine, and they died as a consequence of it. So that led to a whole mind shift, a whole shift in the approach. And it led to, I think, vets realizing that we can't just let the pharmaceutical industry that produce the vaccines be the one who tell us how to use the vaccines. And that is how it's been, believe it or not. Vets would do what it said on the tin. I was going to say, it says on the vial how to give it, and the only person who had an opinion, the only people who decided what to write there were the people who were selling the vaccines. There was no independent body looking at the health of animals and looking at the actual need for vaccines. But from the late 90s into the new millennium, veterinary expert groups were formed to look at this in America first, and later the WSAVA, the World Small Animal Veterinary Association, which I would invite everyone to look at, WSAVA.org, World Small Animal Veterinary Association. They have published vaccine guidelines, and they're readily available for everyone. They have versions for vets and they have versions for pet owners. And they are independent of any, well, as much as is possible in this world, I suppose, but I mean, they are independent of the pharmaceutical industry. They are looking at the science behind vaccination, and what they're saying is different from what the vaccine producers are saying. But the people who write these guidelines are, professors in immunology from all over the world. They are the world's leading expert in this field who have been put together to advise vets. So I don't think, in terms of the scientific argument, or in terms of the veterinary community, I don't hear a discussion at all. It's like these are the gurus, these are the professors at 4 vet schools in Australia, in Holland, in America, and in England. The 4 top people who know the science about this have written these guidelines, so no one's arguing with them. But what does tend to happen, which I find very frustrating, is that a lot of people are just not following what the guidelines are saying. It's almost as if, well, I don't know, I don't have an explanation, but a lot of vets are not following the guidelines.
You can understand, can't you, that the pet owner wouldn't know about the guidelines.
Well, exactly.
You expect your vet to be following world veterinary guidelines. You just expect them to be doing that.
You would.
Sort of seeing, the way I see the vaccinations is they're a bit like a product, and they're sold as a product rather than actually a preventative care, which really they should be. Yes,
and it's easy. I think there is a cultural problem in the veterinary profession sometimes. It varies very much where you are. In some countries this is not the case, but in some places it is the case that there isn't maybe a strong, I mean, you're in a small private business and you're trying to get through the day, and maybe you don't have the time or the financial situation to go on too many courses and update your knowledge. But I mean, this is such a big topic, and this is something that every vet does every day. I don't think there's any, when I talk about this, there's partly the paradox that dog owners who inform themselves can end up going to the vet and actually knowing better than the vet and being able to cite the science better than the vet. And it shouldn't be like that. And you often hear the argument that the vets are just, they just want to make money. And I don't think that's the case at all. The vets are there, every single one of them, because they want to help animals. But there is just, I don't know, it's taking too long to get the science implemented properly, because the science is there. It's not really being discussed, it's being presented, and it's really on vets everywhere to follow this. Well, I tend to puppy owners, though, if I'm asked, do you know a good vet in our area? I normally say that we now have the perfect test, though, because you can call 5 veterinary clinics in your area and ask them what they recommend about vaccination, and if they don't say what's in the guidelines and what we're going to talk about today, then choose another vet. So there is a very clear test now for, is my vet up to date or is my vet not up to date?
Yeah, obviously. Do you think also that in multi-vet practices, the receptionist may not actually know which vet's going to have which set of knowledge? Because I mean, I'm just guessing now, but from the way I think of veterinary practices, you do seem to have a few vets in one practice now, and they maybe do one day a week if they're a locum, or so you're kind of stabbing in the dark, hoping the receptionist knows what they know.
Well, yeah, the receptionist is the most important person in the vet practice, really. But I mean, there shouldn't be a question about every vet in every practice following the WSAVA guidelines, but certainly continuity of care is a problem, and increasingly independent veterinary practices are becoming very, very few and far between, and clinics are being taken over by big chains. So it's harder to secure that personal contact. And I have a chapter in my book about this. I think it's really important that you choose one vet, you find one vet, and you have some important conversations with them and you stick with them. And if you're in a multi-vet practice, I think you just need to, ask for the vet by name and you book the appointment. Because you need that relationship. It's really important. It's always more important who your vet is, I think, than who your GP is. Your dog has a shorter life. There's going to be things happening, and you need someone on your side, someone who you can trust.
Absolutely. What do the guidelines suggest then?
Yes, the guidelines say that they are written with the purpose of ensuring that all dogs and cats are protected against contagious diseases, while at the same time minimizing the number of vaccines given to each animal. And I nearly fell off my chair when I read that in the first version that came out like 15 years ago. They say it, they're not mincing their words. They are very, very clear. And they're saying that the aim of the guidelines is to give each animal fewer vaccines, and they discuss the risk of side effects. Their conclusion is that side effects obviously happen, but they are very rarely identified as side effects. It's very difficult, like the cats with the cancer that I talked about before, that is directly caused by vaccination, may happen years after the vaccine is given. And vaccines can cause allergies, they can cause epilepsy, they can cause all sorts of problems. But in the individual case, it's very difficult to know if a dog has vaccines and it becomes sick 6 months later, or even several years later, whether there is a connection or not. But the guidelines do say that they can cause vaccines ages after the vaccine that caused or triggered I think I said vaccines, I meant side effects. Vaccine can cause side effects, and they can do so months or years after the vaccine that directly caused or triggered them. And that they are therefore not at all reported in a way that gives us a chance of knowing how common they really are. We just don't know. But the point that they then move on to is to say, forget about side effects for a minute. We know they can happen. We know that they are underreported. We don't know how often they happen. But even if we forget about them, it is just part of a gold standard in medicine. It's part of good practice that you don't inject anyone with a medicine without being absolutely sure that they'll benefit from it. And that therefore, as a vet, you need to consider every time you're considering giving someone a vaccine, you really need to weigh that up. You can't just stick with that approach we had 15, 20 years ago of, well, they can't do harm, let's just bung them in. You really need to stop and think every single time. But the guidelines make it very easy for us. What they're saying is, if we stick to dogs, they divide the vaccines into two groups: core vaccines and non-core vaccines. And they're saying the non-core vaccines should not be given routinely to all animals. They should not be given unless there is a particular reason why this animal should have that vaccine, because of the lifestyle it has or the geographical region where it lives or whatever. But they're not on the list of vaccines that all dogs benefit from. The risk-benefit balance has to be right. And for these vaccines to be indicated, the risk needs to be unusually high.
And I'm guessing we're talking kennel cough, leptospirosis.
Exactly. Yeah, we're talking kennel cough, leptospirosis.
Which are both, as I understand it, bacteria, and so not easy to vaccinate against anyway. I
have heard two of the authors of the guidelines say, it doesn't say so in the guidelines, but I've heard two of the authors of the guidelines say you can't vaccinate against kennel cough. Mm-hmm. It's a cold. You know, yeah. It's silly to think that you can make an effective vaccine against the common cold. And also, why would you want to? You know, it's not a deadly disease. If you wanted to vaccinate someone against kennel cough, I don't know, if you have a French bulldog with asthma who really can't have a cold, maybe you might consider it in a case like that. But it's for those particular at-risk patients. It's not for everybody. And if they're saying it doesn't work at all, then obviously it doesn't make sense giving it. But the guidelines doesn't say that the vaccine doesn't work. But like I said, I've heard two of the authors of the guidelines say so in talks that they've given. It's certainly not an effective vaccine, which makes sense because it's a vaccine against a cold that is caused by lots of different agents. So it's not an effective vaccine.
It's optional in a lot, well, it always used to be optional in the kennels that I worked at for many years, although the core vaccines do tend to be, need to be adhered to use those kind of facilities. I'm pretty sure that most of them, it isn't actually kind of law, if you like, or legislation that they have to, or dogs have to have the kennel cough vaccine before they go.
And the main reason people give it is if they have to go to a kennel, they want to attend classes or whatever, where it's a requirement.
It's actually a requirement, though. That's what I'm saying. I don't know. That
I don't think it's legislation on a national level, but lots of dog groups or associations still ask for it. It doesn't worry me as a vaccine. The only side effect I see from the kennel cough vaccine is that you can get kennel cough from it, but but it just seems
horrid, though. I mean, it can be really awful for dogs.
Well, no, absolutely. But I mean, it's also just to justify giving a vaccine, there has to be two criteria fulfilled. One is that the vaccine, well, more than two, but the main two is that the disease is one that you're going to encounter. And the other is that if you do so, it has to be really serious. You know, it has to cause serious illness or death. And of course, there's also the criteria, the vaccine has to be safe and effective. And
isn't maybe that life-threatening to warrant a vaccine.
Your sound is going down for me a little bit. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe isn't as life-threatening to warrant the vaccine.
That will be my point. And also, I mean, if the experts are questioning whether it actually works at all, but it's actually easy to relate to vaccine advice now because it's so clearly put out in the guidelines, and they are saying all dogs should have core vaccines, and the core vaccines are Parvo virus, distemper, and adenovirus, generally given together in the same syringe, and all dogs should be vaccinated against those diseases. And not all dogs should not have core vaccines automatically. That's a conversation to have with your vet. And if there is a vet who thinks that, you know, everybody should have everything, then they haven't understood the guidelines or haven't read the guidelines. Yeah. And the next step then this goal of the guidelines of vaccinating each dog with as few vaccines as possible in their lifetime. There's two ways that you do that. You look very carefully at whether or not your dog needs the the non-core vaccines. And then for the core vaccines that everybody should have, you make sure not to repeat them unnecessarily. And that's where one of my favorite topics at the moment, the titer testing, comes in, because it's so easy. You don't have to guess, you don't have to believe how long a vaccine lasts. It's not a matter of, there's not an argument worth having almost, because for each animal you can take a blood test and you can check. And the guidelines are very clear that the titer test is fully validated, you can trust it.
Yes.
So I think that's the thing to do.
And you can get the Vaccinate pack. I'm pretty sure and I think it might be something, I think when I had a different interview, it was about 8 in a pack or something like that. So if you close,
it's 12, there's 12 in a pack. I mean, it's something that the vet does, and some argue that it's expensive, or it's marginally more expensive than the vaccine. But if the vet sort of streamlines the process and runs a 12 at a time, you can really keep the cost down. And the price varies enormously. But I would always go for a vet who has the in-house test, so that they do it themselves at the clinic. Because if you send it off to a lab, you can suddenly be paying hundreds of pounds and get weird, ambivalent answers that no one knows what to do with. It's much easier to go with a vet who has the in-house titer test. Also because it tells you something about that vet and their knowledge and their commitment. And vice versa, I would almost say, if they don't.
Absolutely, absolutely. The only thing with titer tests is that, of course, they're not testing for actual immunity the way we're sold a vaccine, that it will go into your body will create the memory of it, and years down the line, if you come along it, you'll produce those antibodies and you'll cope with that disease, or you won't get it in the first place. That's how we're sold a vaccine, really. But the titer test can't test for that memory immunity.
No.
So what it's testing for, which is partly how we got into conversation on Instagram, but what it's testing for is antibodies that are in the blood at the time. So your dog has to have come across that disease to then rely on the memory to produce the
No, the dog, I mean, well, that's only if you've never vaccinated it. The concept is that you have a vaccinated dog, and on the basis of the vaccine, the dog produce antibodies. And absolutely, the immune system is much more complex than just producing antibodies. It also produces these memory cells that, as I say, they look after the recipe for the antibodies, so that they can produce them in the future if they need to, and we can't test for them. So there is a theoretical risk that you vaccinate and the dog reacts appropriately to the vaccine, but you can't detect the antibodies in the blood. But in practice, it doesn't seem to happen, because when we titer test, they are positive. And obviously, I mean, we can't titer test, like you said, we can't test for memory cells. We can only test for antibodies. But if a dog has been vaccinated and has responded to vaccination, those antibodies are detectable in a titer test. And there was an article published from where the evidence was partly gathered from the clinic where I work in London, where they looked at blood tests from lots and lots of dogs, and some of those were vaccinated 10 years before the titer test, and there were still antibodies.
Do you think they were the same antibodies produced at the time of the vaccination, though, or the dog has come across the disease since?
Oh, I'm sure the dog has not come across the disease. Some of these diseases, I mean, adenovirus, particularly hepatitis, is almost extinct. Dogs don't come around that. We don't see it. I've never seen it, ever, in 30 years as a vet. Distemper is not extinct, but it's getting there. I have not seen that in more than 20 years. So it's not, I mean, the one that is around, again, it depends where you live in the world. But if you're living in Western Europe, if you're in England or if you're in Denmark, the one that your dog has a risk of coming across is Parvo virus. But when we vaccinate against all three, and when we titer test, we find antibodies against all three. So I've not heard it argued, and I don't see any reason to think that those antibodies would not come from the vaccines. Certainly these are, I mean, hepatitis and distemper are not diseases that dogs in 99.9999% of the cases living in Europe would ever come across. So I think it's just a test that works, really.
Yeah,
But you're right, theoretically, the dog could form memory cells, not bother with the antibodies, and we would not be able to test. But if it hadn't been exposed, but it just doesn't seem, I mean, it probably happens in a very few cases, and those cases we will vaccinate unnecessarily. But when we look at blood from dogs that have been vaccinated at some point in the last 10 years, it's a very high, I haven't got the article with me now, but it's 90-something% that have antibodies, even the vaccine, even if the vaccine was against all 3 diseases, even if the vaccine was years and years and years and years and years ago. But the science has also been done. Actually, the science has been done, to answer your question more correctly, because they did a very interesting study where they vaccinated a bunch of puppies, titer tested them at 4 months old, kept them isolated exactly to not have this argument about whether it was natural exposure that gave them the antibodies. They kept them completely isolated in a lab for their full natural lifetime. I mean, you can think, well, yeah, exactly, but I mean, they just had each other.
But we don't need it done like that.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, these puppies, I think the oldest lived to be 14, and they were never vaccinated again, but they were titer tested at regular intervals, and they lived completely separated from the external world, and their antibody levels remained absolutely consistently high.
Over 7 years? Because I've only seen evidence from Ron Schultz over about 7 years. So
no, there's I can find the science. I think there is, my memory's awful, but I think the serological testing has been done for 9 years, and well, I can't remember which way around, but serological testing, one of them is for 9 years and the other is for 14, where they've tried to expose animals to disease to see if they got ill. But there's certainly no studies have shown that that immunity falls at all just because of time. And that's the other argument, because when we talk about titer testing, I find a lot of people who don't trust it for vaguely mysterious reasons to me, since the experts are absolutely validating it. Yes. Michael Day, who was the president of the WSAVA Vaccine Guideline Group, probably the person in the world who knew the most about vaccines, called the in-house titer test the vet's newest revolutionary tool. So why everyone shouldn't embrace it is completely beyond me.
Perhaps they don't. Some of them just don't know. It can only be that they don't know, because surely if you've gone into veterinary medicine, you care about animals. So you have to take on the new science and the new protocols and what your association is encouraging you to do, surely. I mean, well,
absolutely.
Sense. I mean, what about from the point of view of vaccinating or what we would call contraindications for animals to even have a vaccine in the first place? Will you just explain to people some of the cases where perhaps actually, regardless of anything we've said tonight, you shouldn't probably be vaccinating your dog anyway?
The main one, I think, is if a dog has had a severe reaction to a vaccine. In the past, then I would never even consider vaccinating that animal again. I think that's number one. And there are, people try to give other brand of vaccines, or they try to give not all the vaccines at the same time, or sometimes they even inject steroids at the same time as the vaccine to try to not have the reaction. But I would really say in that case, for that individual animal, the risk of if you have an animal who is probably genetically sensitive to and predisposed to suffer vaccines adverse events, I mean, any day I would say to that particular dog, the risk of the vaccine has got to be higher than the risk of the disease. So just don't even go there. If an animal has already had a poor response, I just really wouldn't. So I think that's the big one for me.
To look at the chat and see if we've had any questions. Those of you that are watching on replay, if you've got any questions, put #replay and we will look at those and answer those as well later on in the week if you watch this later on. But I'm going to have a look at the chat now, and I have to go in on my phone because it doesn't show us. But what I was hoping is I have, you can answer this question while I'm having a look. I do have an idea in my mind that there is a statement that only healthy dogs should be vaccinated.
Yeah.
So with this contraindication topic that we're on at the moment, you know, if you've got a dog that's got histamine intolerance, or if you've got a dog that's got IBD or anything that's related to the gut lining, which, as we know, is heavily involved in the immune response in the first place. You know, if your dog's got IBD or anything, you know, anything a bit like that, you know, digestive complaints, should we be vaccinating those dogs?
Thank you. That's a really good point. Yes, it says that in the data sheet that comes with every vaccine. It says should only be given to healthy animals. I used to spend a lot of time talking about that with animal carers of chronically sick animal and advising against vaccination, and, you know, is the risk of catching the disease that we vaccinate against higher than the risk of worsening the current condition. But I find that it's not that relevant anymore, because I just tell everyone to titer test. And if you have an adult dog with a chronic disease, I mean, my experience with titer testing is that the only situation where they generally fail a titer test is if they never vaccinated to their puppy vaccines, and you titer test a young dog and it's negative, and I'm absolutely sure that dog was never positive. Then you may have given that puppy several vaccines, but it never responded. But once you have an adult dog who has responded to vaccination, those titer tests remain positive. So it becomes less of an issue. It becomes a lot simpler to advise someone with a chronically ill animal, because I would say to them what I say to anyone: if your dog is, you know, I mean, if you have an adult dog, if your dog is not a puppy anymore, it's past 1 year really, you should have had a positive titer test, and in that case you just repeat that every 3 years, and in almost any case I can think of, they come out positive, and then there's no discussion to have, because of course we don't vaccinate them. So it's made life so much easier in many ways that we can now check for each animal.
Yeah, and I've got some comments here. Somebody is saying, let's have a look. So Elder Carla says, my dog had several thousand antibodies for parvo, but only a few for the other two. So she must mean the distemper and the hepatitis. So, I mean, in that case, what you're talking about is potentially, she's mentioning here, maybe the dog had come across parvo and that had sent the antibody rate up, but it could be that the hepatitis, that could be the case maybe. But
it could be, it could not be. I mean, it's difficult to advise based on the test, because it sounds like a test that was done at a lab, and they become very difficult to comment on. The easy way to do it is if you do the VaciCheck, because it just tells you yes or no. And even if you have a high titer for one disease and a low titer for a couple of other diseases, as long as it's above that threshold where it's considered actually significantly positive, it doesn't matter whether it's low or high or medium. If it's positive, it's positive.
Exactly, they've got them. So Gemma also says, which I've seen so many times, this kind of comment that it was £250 for a single titer test, which
that's what I mean. This is if you send it up to a lab. I've heard even worse. If you phone around, you can get it done. You can certainly get it done for less than £50.
If, for instance, people printed off the guidelines, which I'll put in the comments below, actually, I can't do that right now, but I will do that as soon as we've finished, the WSAVA guidelines, printed off information about VaciCheck and took these into their vets, surely the vet will be more amenable.
Well, absolutely. I mean, when people contact me and they're frustrated because they've maybe been to my talks, and may I just mention, it is also in my book, The Complete Book of Cat and Dog Health. I also discuss this topic in full, and I very frequently get contacted by dog owners who follow the advice in my book and their vet doesn't agree. And I have to say, it's not really a question of agreeing. It's a question, I mean, not about everything. I'm not saying I'm right about everything, but this particular topic is about being informed or not being informed. And I think a good question to ask your vet, if they are insisting on outdated advice, is just to very kindly and politely say, is there a reason why you're not following the WSAVA advice? Because that's unusual. I mean, there is no individual vet in practice anywhere who knows better than the people who wrote the guidelines. So it's just a matter of reading them, but it can be uphill. And if your vet 15 years after the first guidelines came out are not following them, sometimes it's just easier to find another vet.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it. And we have to have a lot more confidence. If only confidence
Yeah.
sold in proper.
But lots of people do. I mean, it is amazing how well informed, and I mean, a lot of people just, well, really, really inform themselves to an amazing level. I'm constantly impressed by that, really.
Yeah. Well, we have to be responsible.
Yeah.
For what's happening with pets. Yeah. So another comment, a lady called Marie Ann, she has asked, why do vets say you need to have puppy vax then the first year before they can teeter? I mean, I would say that's just because they're not following the protocol, they're not aware of it.
Yeah. I mean, the advice is certainly from the president, or the previous president, who sadly passed away now, of the WSAVA vaccine guideline group, that if you because what they're now recommending is that you do a 4th puppy vaccine or a teeter test at 6 months. And he says if you teeter test at 6 months and you get a positive test at 6 months, then you can go directly into the adult schedule of teeter testing every 3 years. So what you're just quoting is not correct advice. You can teeter test at 4 to 6 months, and then you can continue teeter testing after that.
So Pam says it just feels very wrong to argue with a very experienced vet, which I agree with. I don't think we should be arguing at all. If you print off those guidelines, that's not an argument. You're simply saying, as the loving owner of my dog, I would like to know if it's possible if we could follow the World Small Animal Veterinary Guidelines.
Yeah.
Say no, you find another vet. There's no argument, I don't think.
No.
And
it is
we're sending you confidence. We're beaming you confidence.
Yeah. It shouldn't be necessary, but everyone is being helped if you take the time to find a vet who's informed and on board. And I do think that's really, really important, because it shouldn't be an argument. But my best advice, if you're in the Australian outback and there's only one vet that you can possibly ever get to, would be to smile very sweetly and say, you know, why is there a reason we're not following the guidelines?
Absolutely. There's also one more question from Ellie. Oh, what? Yes. Who's just walked up and then decided to whine, so she's obviously got something to tell me. Ellie says, would you always vaccinate puppies? So we're back on the puppy.
Yeah, yes, I think I would. I mean, there's always an exception. There might be very sickly puppies, or some litters seem, I hear regularly of litters where all the puppies seem to get very ill immediately after vaccine. You know, there are very specific circumstances like that, where maybe if you vaccinated 3 out of 4 in a litter and those 3 came down with seizures immediately afterwards, I wouldn't vaccinate the 4th. And I wouldn't vaccinate ill animals, but as a general recommendation, yes, I would certainly vaccinate a puppy. Puppies are the ones that are at risk. When I was a very young vet, I used to work for the PDSA in London, that in an area where most animals were not vaccinated. And I don't know if it's like that anymore, but the PDSA did not provide vaccines. There was no, healthcare procedures like that. It was only treating ill animals. And we had puppies with Parvo virus, and I've cared for those puppies with Parvo virus, and they are horribly ill, and they don't all survive, and they suffer, and it's not a joke. And it happens, and it's around, and vaccination has stopped that. And the animals that are the most at risk of dying from Parvo virus are puppies, certainly in their first year, but young puppies. So I wouldn't take lightly on not vaccinating a puppy, but equally I wouldn't over vaccinate anyone. I think we have to find that balance where we vaccinate to protect, but we don't vaccinate any more than is needed to maintain that protection at all. And that's what we've been doing.
no, not projection. What would it be? That's the combination of the two that I was thinking in my mind. It'd be protection over injection.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the new hashtag, I think.
Exactly. I mean, you don't get more protection. You don't get better protected by having more injections. You are either, it's like being pregnant. It's a binary state. You're either protected or you're not protected.
Yes.
You can't be so to a smaller or bigger degree.
Yes.
So you just need, for most animals, it's just, 1 or 2 vaccines in their whole life to have lifelong full protection.
As we do.
Yeah, exactly. Again, I mean, a very good point. We're not having whatever jabs we had as babies, we're not having them repeated through our lives. And there is no reason why the dogs are different. There's really no reason.
I would imagine there's going to be some people watching this that don't now vaccinate for core vaccines and are not very pro kennel cough either. But let's just talk about leptospirosis as our final subject, because obviously there's many strains of this.
Yeah.
Or I think they call them serovars, don't they? So,
yeah.
What should people do? Because this does tend to be that, okay, I'm with you with the core vaccines, I'm with you with kennel cough, but what shall I do about this?
It depends a lot on where you live and what kind of a dog you have. Leptospirosis is primarily a tropical disease. So, South America, huge problem for people and for dogs. It's obviously also a disease that affects people more so than it affects dogs. Yet we're not being vaccinated against it on an annual basis. The disease exists. It exists in the UK as well. It's not common, but it's around. The problem with it is that it doesn't have the vaccine's not very effective. It covers certain serovars, like you said, certain types out of many. So you can certainly get leptospirosis without even having had a vaccine. The vaccine doesn't offer very good protection. And it has also been argued that it's probably the vaccine that causes the most side effects. It's not an easy decision, and it really depends on your dog. If you live in a city, or if you have a toy breed dog, I would not even consider it. Really? If you live in the countryside and if you're on a farm and you have a terrier that catches and eats rats on a daily basis, I'm not sure what I'd do. I'd probably think about it at least. If you have a dog that you take hunting, maybe there's it's about exposure, but it's that conversation that you need to have on an individual basis with your vet, depending on, ask them. It's not a very good vaccine. So even if all the dogs in the area were vaccinated, they would still see lepto if it was around. So ask them, how many cases do they see? Not ever. Not did they read an article about a case in the next county last year? How many cases of lepto have they properly diagnosed in their practice this year? And if it's like hardly any or none, then it's obviously not as prevalent as in other places where you'd worry more. But that's another reason why you just need to have that vet who is open to have this conversation. And obviously, if you have a Pomeranian or a Cavalier Charles Spaniel, or just don't go there. That's my personal advice.
Yeah. Well, and very, very educated as well, and professionally experienced as well. To be honest, I think there's a lot for people to take in, and I'm wondering how much of this is also in your book. Show us your book again.
Yes, the book is the complete book of cat and dog health. It's the first. There's a lot in it, but the first section, the first third of the book, is about these healthy lifestyle choices. So it discusses puppyhood, it discusses old age, it talks about finding the right vet, and then it discusses these 4 topics that we started out talking about: diet, neutering, vaccination, and parasite control. And it does lay out what the guidelines say about vaccination and what it means in practical terms, and how to use titer testing. So it should all be in there. I
did put a link up to the W.H. Smith. I can bring
I saw that. Thank
one
you.
up. Yeah, I thought we'll put W.H. Smith. No one them anymore. the business a bit longer.
Well,
So
absolutely.
where else can people get it? I mean, can they buy it direct from you? Because obviously it's much nicer.
They can't buy it direct from me. They can buy it direct from the publisher, which is called Hubble and Hattie. But when I checked yesterday, their website was down. So I don't know if it's up again, actually. But normally you can buy it from their web shop. But anywhere that sells books should have it, or certainly be able to order it.
Yeah, and also I want you guys to comment at the bottom if you want us to talk about vaccines again, if you feel like we've covered enough, because we're going to have to end. I mean, this is meant to be a half an hour show and it's so exciting. It's now been 45 minutes. So I would, love to talk about things we can do instead, but we definitely don't have time today. The kennels that I worked at for many years, we had an isolation at the time we were allowed to. So towards the end, we weren't really, because the legislation was getting more and more stuck to, really, but we had like an isolation and we accepted no-sewed dogs and all sorts. So, that kind of thing I'd love to talk about. And also I know you are obviously a qualified homeopathic vet as well, so perfect person to discuss it if you want to come back.
Sure.
And another topic Catherine O'Driscoll used to talk about a lot, who I just amazing lady, taken far too young. And she used to talk a lot about colostrum and different immune support. So it'd be really cool to get you back on. What can we do instead of a vaccine? If
well, absolutely. I mean, we tend to get stuck in this idea that being protected against disease is about vaccines, and it's obviously not at all. It's about all these components to a healthy lifestyle.
Let's come back in maybe a month. Do that. We can absolutely do that. So we are approaching the end of February. And I have a fun announcement that we are going to be having some puppy parties live online. They're going to be every Sunday throughout March, celebrating the launch of our Naked Pup food. And we're going to have all sorts of special guests. So they're going to be much more party style than they are the way we've been chatting tonight. So we're having some surprise guests that will just pop in occasionally throughout Zoom. We've got some actual puppies as well, so we can all go ooh and ah over the lovely puppies as well. And the other thing to mention as well is, if you are feeding naked dog to your dog, or if you've just got a puppy and you might want to do so, and you want to star on our show and ask any questions, then you can also do that as well. So an opportunity for you to join the party if you want to, and be part of our naked dog puppy parties, or naked puppy parties. We also have, as part of these puppy parties, Caroline Wilkinson, who is a certified dog trainer and behaviourist. So she's going to be with us for the whole of the puppy party and answering different questions. There's also going to be lots of competitions as well, and chances to win fun stuff related to raw dog food. So yes, thank you so much for watching Naked Truths again. Share this video if you know someone who might be wondering about whether they should vaccinate their dog. Then do share this video, because this has been extremely brilliant, professional, experienced veterinary advice tonight. It may even be something you want to hop over and send your vet as well, if they want to watch it. They can bring themselves to watch it. Thank you so much for being with us, and I will see you next Tuesday, where we have Brendan Clark, Dr. Brendan Clark, who is going to be talking to us about bacteria in raw food, the truth about bacteria in raw food, and the new Raw Safe. Now it's an auditing, I don't want to call it an accreditation, it's an auditing service that vets are offering. So Brendan's going to be talking to us about that as well, as part of our bacteria in raw food episode next week. So thanks once again, and see you next week.